a man is found frozen in the Alps, preserved for 5,300 years. And when scientists examine what he is carrying, they find a copper axe made from ore, quarried 500 kilometers away in Tuscany. Flint tools sourced from 3 separate mountain regions. 14 arrows, a longbow still being finished, clothing stitched from at least 5 different animal species. Everything about his equipment says this man was plugged into a wide, sophisticated world. And then they read his DNA, and his DNA says this man's specific lineage has never been found in any other human being who has ever lived. That is the contradiction that sits at the center of Ötzi the Iceman. His tools put him in a network, his genome puts him nowhere, or rather, everywhere that has since vanished. Ötzi was recovered on the 19th of September, 1991, by 2 German hikers who initially thought they had found a recent accident victim. He was lying face down in a rocky gully at 3,200 meters elevation in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between what is now Austria and Italy. When forensic teams arrived and began examining the body, they found it in a state of preservation that defied expectation. Tissue intact, equipment intact, even his last meal, still identifiable in his stomach, dried, fatty, wild goat meat, essentially the Copper Age equivalent of beef jerky, consumed roughly 30 to 60 minutes before he died. And the cause of death, once CT scans revealed an arrowhead lodged between his left shoulder blade and rib cage, was clear. Someone shot him from behind, severed a major artery, and left him there. The copper axe lying beside him, the most valuable object a Copper Age European could own, was not taken. Whoever killed him walked away without the prize. That detail alone has puzzled researchers for 30 years, but the murder is not the deepest mystery Ötzi left behind. The deepest mystery is what his genome says about who he actually was. And to explain why that matters, you need to understand what the genome was supposed to say, and why the first answer turned out to be wrong. When scientists decoded Ötzi's DNA in 2012, they announced a finding that seemed to make immediate sense. He was most closely related to Sardinians and other genetically isolated southern Europeans. They also detected what appeared to be ancestry from the steppe herders, the semi-nomadic pastoralists who swept into Europe from the eastern grasslands roughly 4,900 years ago. For a decade, that was the settled picture. Ötzi as a Copper Age European carrying the expected mix of ancestries from his era. Then in 2023, a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology resequenced his genome using modern, high-coverage technology. The earlier sample had been heavily contaminated with present-day human DNA. Researchers who had handled the mummy had left their own genetic material behind, and it had skewed every calculation. The clean genome told a different story. No steppe ancestry whatsoever. Instead, Ötzi had approximately 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, the highest proportion of any Copper Age European yet tested, and almost no genetic signal from the Western European hunter-gatherers who had lived in that region for tens of thousands of years before the farmers arrived. He was, genetically, almost entirely the product of the farming migration that had come out of what is now Turkey 8,000 years ago. He also had dark skin, dark eyes, and was losing his hair. A complete reversal of the fair-skinned, lighter-haired image that had illustrated museum reconstructions for a decade. The physical appearance of the most famous prehistoric European had been wrong. And that correction was just the beginning of what the genome had to say. And before I get to what happened after Ötzi's world ended, there is something written directly on his body that deserves its own moment, because it rewrites the timeline of an entire medical tradition. Ötzi had 61 tattoos. They are the oldest tattoos ever documented on a human body. And for years, researchers assumed they were decorative, symbols of status, ritual markings, tribal identity. Then someone mapped them anatomically. Every single cluster sits precisely on what traditional Chinese medicine identifies as acupuncture meridian points. Not approximately, not near, on. And when those tattoo locations were cross-referenced against Ötzi's CT scans, the overlap became impossible to dismiss. The tattoos concentrate over his lumbar spine, his right knee, his left ankle, his Achilles tendon. Every location where his skeletal remains show severe degenerative arthritis and joint damage. He was not decorating himself. He was treating himself, marking the places that hurt, pressing charcoal pigment into the skin above the joints that were failing him, using a therapeutic logic that Europe would not independently develop for another 2,000 years. the formal tradition we associate with ancient China appears in this man's skin in the Alps in the 33rd century BCE. Whether it represents parallel discovery or contact, no one has yet traced. Researchers genuinely do not know. What they know is that the oldest tattoos in the world are a medical record, and the patient was already dead when we finally learned to read them. But the longer I stayed with it, the more I realized the tattoos were actually the cleaner mystery. What his equipment refuses to explain is harder to close. The tools say Ötzi was a man of the world. The copper for his axe came from southern Tuscany. His chert came from multiple Alpine quarry sites. His arrows used wood species he would have needed to select deliberately. His clothing required knowledge of at least 5 different animal species and their properties. Everything he carried was a product of connection to other people, other places, other groups. A man with that equipment must have had access to trade routes, to exchange networks, to relationships across hundreds of kilometers. And yet his genome, at the level of specific lineage, points to a man who was genetically isolated to a degree almost without parallel among his contemporaries. His Y chromosome haplogroup, the paternal line passed unchanged from father to son, is designated G2AZ6208. It has never been found in any other ancient sample. It has never been found in any living person. Of 3,700 male blood donors tested from the Tyrol region where Ötzi was discovered, only 19 carried a distant paternal relative of that lineage. Not descendants, not close relatives, but haplogroup cousins several branches removed. His specific cell lineage is, for all practical purposes, extinct, and his maternal line, the K1U subclade traced through mitochondrial DNA, is equally absent from every ancient and modern database ever compiled. The man carried by these long-distance trade networks left behind, genetically, no trail whatsoever. A 2025 study published in Nature Communications then added one more layer, and this is the part where the isolation becomes something stranger than simple geography. Researchers analyzed the genomes of 47 other ancient individuals who lived in the same Alpine region as Ötzi, spanning the period from approximately 6,400 to 1,300 BCE. They found that most of these people shared 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, broadly consistent with Ötzi, and that the region functioned as a genetic refuge, changing very little over more than 2,000 years. The Alps were an isolating environment. They kept a relatively uniform population in place while the rest of Europe was shifting. But Ötzi, even within this stable, uniform genetic neighborhood, was an outlier. His specific Y chromosome and maternal lineages matched none of them. He was genetically distinct from the people living within walking distance of where he died. The researchers wrote plainly that this genetic singularity raises more questions than it answers. Was he from a lineage that simply failed to leave broader traces? Was he an exile, part of a kin group so small it left no record? They did not know. The DNA that was supposed to clarify who he was has instead produced a man with no genetic anchor. Surrounded by people he did not closely match, carrying tools that connected him to a world hundreds of kilometers wide, and leaving behind a lineage that ends with him. And then I looked at what happened to the type of person Ötzi represented, not him specifically, but the broader population he came from. And the scale of what that means took a long time to process. Ötzi's paternal haplogroup, G2A, was not rare in his time. Ancient DNA studies across Neolithic Europe show it was one of the dominant Y chromosome lineages among early farmers from Anatolia as they spread west across the continent. Site after site, from Hungary to France to Britain, the Neolithic farming period is marked by G2A. It was, for a window of several thousand years, one of the most common Y chromosomes in all of Europe. Today it survives at significant frequency only in Sardinia and Corsica, isolated island populations that the next demographic wave could not easily reach. Everywhere else, it was replaced. Starting around 4,900 years ago, herders from the Pontic steppe, carrying the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, began moving into Europe in numbers that archaeologists and geneticists have described as a replacement event with very few parallels in the prehistoric record. Studies of Bronze Age European DNA show that in some regions, steppe-related ancestry went from essentially 0 to over 70% within a few centuries. The Y chromosome turnover was even more extreme than the autosomal shift, which suggests the replacement was not symmetrical between men and women. Steppe men were reproducing at vastly higher rates than the men they displaced. G2A was not driven to extinction through violence alone. It was numerically overwhelmed, the same slow erasure through demographic advantage that has rewritten population histories on every inhabited continent. Ötzi died 3 centuries before that wave arrived in the Alps. He did not live to see what was coming, but everything his genome represents, the Anatolian-derived Neolithic farming world that had held Europe for 4,000 years, was about to be demographically overwritten in a span of time so short it barely registers on a geological scale. Which brings me back to the copper axe sitting beside his body, abandoned by whoever killed him, and the question of what that abandonment actually means. Forensic analysis found blood from at least 4 different people on Ötzi's equipment. His own blood, someone else's on his knife, more on his arrowheads, suggesting he had shot at people recently, a 4th person's DNA on his coat. He had a partially healed slash wound on his right hand, consistent with grabbing an opponent's blade, a wound that had been healing for several days before he died, meaning he had already survived at least one violent encounter in the days prior. He ate his last meal within the hour before the arrow struck, which means he was not fleeing in panic. He had stopped. He had rested. He had eaten. Whatever threat was following him, he did not know it was close enough to kill him. The arrow came from behind, at a range and angle that forensic reconstruction suggests was deliberate and precise. Whoever fired it knew what they were doing, and they left the copper axe behind, an object worth more than almost anything a Copper Age person could possess, a status marker so significant that high-ranking men in this period were buried with their copper axes as grave goods. They walked away from it. The most coherent explanation forensic researchers have offered is that taking it would have identified the killer. The axe was too distinctive, too recognizable. It had to be left. And so 5,300 years later, it is still there, in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, next to the body of the man whose genome connects to no one alive and whose murder connected to no suspect ever named. And then there is the detail that changed how investigators read the entire murder. The detail that moved the conclusion from ambush to something more deliberate. Ötzi was carrying 14 arrows in his quiver. 2 were finished, tipped with flint, ready to fire. 12 were unfinished, still being worked. Researchers analyzed the arrowheads he carried, the material, the napping style, the sourcing of the stone. They are consistent with each other. They match regional Alpine flint traditions. They are, in every technical sense, his arrows, made by his hand or by people in his community using materials from his territory. The arrowhead lodged between his shoulder blade and his rib cage does not match any of them. Different flint type, different sourcing region, different napping technique. The arrow that killed Ötzi was not opportunistically grabbed from a shared supply. It was not a stray shot from a passing stranger. It was made somewhere else, carried up that mountain by someone who came prepared to use it. Forensic researchers describing this finding use the word premeditated. Someone knew where Ötzi was going, someone followed him, or was already waiting. Someone brought their own arrow because they had already decided, before they started climbing, that they were not coming back down without having fired it. The glacier preserved the body. The arrowhead preserved the proof, and the proof is that whatever Ötzi was running from, it was already too late before he sat down to eat. The axe outlasted the man outlasted his entire genetic world. The tools connected him to a living world. The DNA recorded the fact that the world his lineage came from was already ending. Not because anyone knew it, not because Ötzi knew it, but because the demographic forces that would erase the Anatolian farming populations of Europe were already in motion, already building on the eastern steppe, already moving west in numbers that no copper axe and no Alpine altitude could stop. Ötzi's genome is, in a very specific sense, the last clear snapshot of a Europe that was about to stop existing. The haplogroup that once dominated Neolithic European men now survives in meaningful numbers only behind ocean water, on islands the steppe herders never quite reached. The specific lineage Ötzi himself carried, G2A Z6208 K18, survives nowhere. It ended with him, or shortly after him, in that Alpine gully. The tools say he was connected. The DNA says the people he was connected to were running out of time. Both things are true. And the reason they feel like a contradiction is that we keep trying to read a 5,000-year-old man the way we read a modern one, as a fixed identity in a stable world. Ötzi was neither. He was a man at the edge of a demographic cliff his entire civilization was about to walk off. His tools reached 500 kilometers south to Tuscany. His genome reached back 8,000 years to Anatolian farmers who had crossed into Europe and built a world that the steppe would swallow whole. The glacier kept him. The DNA told the truth about what he was part of and what was lost. If that opened something for you, a like takes 3 seconds and matters more than you might think for a channel built on questions like this one. For anyone who wants to be here when the next piece of buried history gets pulled into the light, subscribe and you will be. Send this to someone who has ever stood in a museum and wondered whether the label on the display case is telling the whole story. And if something stayed with you, the axe left behind, the lineage that ends with a single frozen body, the steppe wave none of them saw coming, leave it in the comments. That is the conversation worth having. Thanks for watching.